Hello! I hope you're doing good today. I've got a story to read to you from this lovely book called The Story Chest. And it's called Jackdaw. I must tell you about Jack. Jack won't like it. He'll squawk and fluff out his black feathers in a huff, but he's our school bird and we're proud of him, even if he is rather bad-tempered. I first met Jack on the day I started school. He was walking up and down on the wall at the end of the playground during morning break. I was standing by the wall because I didn't like the big wide space in the middle of the playground. For a while, I watched this strange black bird with a grey head, and then I said, "Hello, birdie, pretty birdie." Jack looked at me with a beady eye and said, Jackdaw, very clearly. A boy was standing beside me. "He's not pretty," the boy said. "Do you like birds?" "I like birds. My granny's got a budgie that can talk." That boy was my first friend at school. He's still my friend too. He's called Robert and I'm called Sarah. After that, Robert and I always went to talk to Jack if he was perched on the wall. Sometimes he made a lot of noise. Jackdaw, he would squawk, and then he would laugh and whistle and make a funny hubbub noise, a lot like a lot of children in a distant playground. But at other times he would not talk at all, even though the whole class would try to make him. He would walk and hop along the wall, opening his beak at us and wagging his head. We asked our teacher, Mrs. Stacy, about Jack. "Now, let me think," she said. "He's a jackdaw, you know, and he's been around the school for a couple of months now. He seems so tame that the headmistress thought he might be someone's pet. We put a notice about him in the village post office, but nobody's claimed him. I don't suppose anybody wanted him. He isn't a pretty sight, is he? All those scruffy grey feathers standing up on his head." Robert and Mrs. Stacy were right. Jack was not a pretty bird. His feathers standing up in spikes made him look as if he was always cross about something, and the way he squawked wasn't very appealing either. Some children said they were frightened of him, but I don't think they were really. Although he sounded fierce, he never pecked anybody. He used to eat out of the pig bins which stood in a row near the school kitchens. All the scraps that didn't get eaten at dinner time used to go in those pig bins. Sometimes Robert and I picked up the lids to look inside because it was so horrible. We saw mashed potato and gravy and vegetables all mixed up with custard and lumps of pudding. It looked really disgusting. Jack loved it. He used to walk up and down nearby pretending to think of other things. Then, if a lid was left a bit askew, he would flap up onto the edge of a bin, grab a piece of pastry or half a fish finger and make off to the top of the game shed to eat it. While he ate it, he would jump and flap and bash his food on the shed roof. He made rather a mess of the roof, and Mr. Hudson, the school caretaker, didn't like him at all. But Robert and I liked Jack more and more. We looked for him every morning when we arrived at school, and we said goodbye to him if he was around when it was time to go home. And Jack began to like us. Robert and I spent a year in Mrs. Stacy's class. After a while, we got used to the big empty playground and played in the middle of it, as well as by the wall. And after a while, Jack got used to it too. He flapped around Robert, saying, "Ark, ark," and tried to join in our games. He particularly liked skipping. As soon as he saw a rope, he would bob up and down as if he were jumping over it. Robert tried to teach him some skipping rhymes. "Come on, Jack," Robert used to say. "I like coffee, I like tea, I like Jackdaw, in with me." But Jack used to turn and walk off hunching his shoulders. Jackdaw," he would say, looking back at Robert. "Perhaps he's too old to learn new words," said Robert. But Robert was wrong. Jack was taking things in all right, and he began to make himself unpopular. Our headmistress was a kind lady and always said good morning to the children in the playground when she arrived at school each day. Usually she said, "Good morning, Robert," or "Good morning, Sarah," because she knew all our names. But sometimes she said, "Good morning, dear," if she wasn't thinking of names just then, and Jack picked it up. One morning the headmistress walked in at the school gate and Jack was waiting for her on the wall. "Good morning, dear," said Jack loudly in exactly the headmistress's voice. The headmistress looked very surprised, but she laughed. "You saucy bird, Jack," she said, and she walked on across the playground. Jack flopped down to the ground and hobbled after her. "Good morning, dear. Good morning, dear. Good morning, dear," he said. "Yes, Jack, I heard you the first time," said the headmistress as she went into school. But Jack didn't take the hint. He carried on saying, "Good morning, dear," to the headmistress every time he saw her, and I could see she got tired of it. There were a lot of children in our school, but Robert was the one Jack liked best. Robert used to bring him little tidbits from home. Once he even brought him some of his 7th birthday cake. Robert put it down on the ground for Jack to peck. Jack squawked and tossed bits of cake into the air, laughing in a cackling voice as he did so. "You've got no manners, Jack," said Robert. "Arp, arp," said Jack happily. Not long after that, Robert was made goalkeeper for the school football team. Jack liked that. He was able to perch on the crossbar of the football goal and keep Robert company. Whenever the ball came anywhere near the goal, Jack used to flap and squawk and nearly fall off his bar with excitement. Robert said it was encouraging to have such a noisy fan, but the sportsmaster said Jack was a plaguey nuisance. One day, a team from the school in the next village came to play our school at football. I was able to watch, although I hadn't been chosen for the team. A boy from the other school team saw Jack flap across the football pitch and land on the goal post. "Look at that old crow," he shouted. "That's a jackdaw," I shouted back at him. "He's our mascot. He brings us luck." And Jack did bring us luck. The visiting team were very good footballers and the ball kept coming dangerously close to Robert's goal. But Jack flapped and yelled and kept distracting the players so that Robert was able to get the ball each time it was kicked towards the goal. Do you want to see a picture? Let's have a look. But at half-time, the teams changed ends and Robert went off down the pitch to defend the other goal. Jack decided to stay put. He perched above the other goalkeeper's head and peered down at him. Then he opened his beak and gaped at him. And just as one of our players was about to kick the ball hard into the goal, Jack said, "Good morning, dear," to the goalkeeper, and the ball slammed into the back of the net. We all cheered and jumped and clapped. Jack squawked and flew off towards the school. "It's that old crow," shouted the goalkeeper. "He distracted me, he did it on purpose." The sportsmaster from the visiting school looked very annoyed. "I'm sorry about the jackdaw," said our sports teacher. "He's becoming a plaguing nuisance around the school. He won't leave us alone." Have you ever heard stories about magpies and jackdaws stealing things? Well, it's true. It isn't that they are dishonest or anything like that. They're just collecting things, especially shiny things. Jack was always on the lookout for something new to add to his collection. The litter bin in the school playground was filled with bits of tinfoil wrappings from sweets and biscuits. Jack used to sort out the bin, hurling any litter he didn't want onto the ground. "That bird makes this school look like a slum," Mr. Hudson, the caretaker, used to say as he cleared up after Jack. For a while we wondered what Jack did with all his bits of foil and rubbish. Then Mr. Hudson found out. Jack stuffed them down the narrow gap between the game shed and the wall of the school. He must have been doing it for months, perhaps for years. The gap was almost filled up with rubbish, and Mr. Hudson spent hours pulling it all out with a pair of tongs on a long stick. "I'll wring that bird's neck if I get half the chance," I heard him mutter. Robert and I were beginning to worry about Jack being in so much trouble. Several of the teachers thought he was nothing but a nuisance. Then he made matters worse by trying to visit Robert in school. We were in Mr. Maynard's class when Jack dropped in on Robert one morning. We'd been set some geography work to get on with when suddenly Jack flapped in at an open window of the classroom and landed with a flump and a squawk on Robert's exercise book. He lay there for a moment with his beak open, as if the drop had been further than he expected. Then he stood up and shook himself a little and said, "Good morning, dear," to Mr. Maynard. Can you imagine? Mr. Maynard was not pleased. He could see what a muddy mess Jack had made of Robert's geography book. "Get that bird out of here, Robert," he said crossly. "Sorry, Mr. Maynard," said Robert, as if he had invited Jack to come and ruin his work. "I'll take him out." But Jack had a different plan. He jumped down to the floor and hopped around under the desks, squawking and grumbling. Suddenly, he spotted a metal pencil sharpener which somebody had dropped on the floor, and he began to pick this up in his beak and hurl it about. This gave Robert a chance to grab him and carry him out. Strangely enough, Jack seemed to like being held by Robert, and he gave a chirpy sound. But then he caught sight of Mr. Maynard and said, "Ark, ark," in a cross voice. "Ark, ark yourself," said Mr. Maynard, "and don't come back." Half an hour later, Jack came back. There was a scratching at the door leading out to the big school corridor. Mr. Maynard opened the door to see what the noise was. "Good morning, dear. Ah," said Jack, standing up very straight, with all his head feathers standing up straight as well. All the class roared with laughter, and Jack laughed too, in a screaming, sort of showing-off voice which made Mr. Maynard furious. "Robert," he said, "get that fowl out of here and shut the school door, and tell him that if he comes in again, I'll wring his neck." "The teachers don't like Jack," said Robert, as we went home that evening. "Do you think Mr. Maynard would really wring his neck?" I asked. "No," said Robert, "but I know Mr. Hudson wants to get rid of him." "How will they do it?" I asked. "I don't know," said Robert, "but we ought to get Jack away from school for a while." 2 evenings later, we had a plan to save Jack. We didn't tell anyone else. But when we were going home, we searched for Jack and found him perched on top of the games shed. "Good morning, dear," he said to Robert in a friendly way. So Robert clambered up onto my shoulders and tried to grab him, but he didn't have to. Jack walked onto his arm and made those chirpy noises he had done in the classroom. Robert was delighted, although it was difficult to climb down again without letting go of Jack. Then we had to run home because we were late for our mothers, who might have been worried. Jack was jolted rather a lot and looked more beady-eyed than usual by the time we reached my house. We just had time to push him under our garage door and shut it down before Robert had to run off home. A little while later, Robert came back with some biscuits and an apple for Jack. "We must give Jack some food," he said. "Then he'll like it here and stay." So I took some of the chocolate cake I had for my tea and went to the garage. Very carefully, we pulled up the swing door and crept inside. "Jack," we whispered, "here's your tea." "Come on, Jack. Where are you?" said Robert. Then we both saw the open window. We'd forgotten about the window. Usually it was shut, but this evening it was open and Jack was gone. We searched the garden, we searched the trees down the road, we went all the way back to school, but Jack was nowhere. He had vanished, and it was all our fault. "I expect he'll turn up at school tomorrow," said Robert, as he went back home that evening. "I hope so," I said, but Jack didn't turn up. Every day Robert and I searched for him. We asked Mr. Hudson if he had seen him, but he said no, and good riddance, I reckon. We asked Mrs. Stacy and all the teachers, who hadn't minded Jack too much, but nobody had seen him. We felt terrible. The football team wondered where their mascot was, and Robert kept letting balls into the goal. We looked hopefully at every passing rook or crow that flew overhead, but it was never Jack. I told my mother what I had done and how sorry I was. She was very kind and said she was sure Jack could look after himself. She also said the village school was better off without him, but I didn't really agree with that. All that happened 2 years ago. Since then, there had been no sign of Jack. No sign, that is, until yesterday. You see, Robert and I started at our new school in town yesterday. We had to go in on a school bus with lots of other children from our village. The new school has green railings along the front to the main road where the buses stop. As we got off our bus, Robert grabbed my arm and pointed. Way down the road, at the very end of the railings, was a small, black, hunched figure. "Hark!" it said as we ran up the road. "Good morning, dear." "Jackdaw!" yelled Robert. "It is! It really is Jack!" I think I have never been so happy, and Jack was happy too. He flapped and bowed and squawked before jumping clumsily onto Robert's shoulder and rubbing his beak against his ear. Robert walked into school with Jack still perched on his shoulder. A teacher came out of the main door. "Don't bring that bird into school," said the teacher. "He's a terrible nuisance. He's become the school mascot and lives in a heap of rubbish behind the bicycle sheds. We wouldn't be without him now, but not inside the school buildings, you understand." So Robert put Jack gently down on the grass in front of the school. "It's nice to see a friendly face in a new school," said Robert, blowing his nose because he was so pleased. "Ark, ark," said Jack, and waddled off around the corner. "I expect he's going to the pig bins," I said happily. In the afternoon, Robert told our new teacher about Jack's story. He was very interested and said he would tell the local newspaper about it. So a photographer came to the school this morning to take Jack's picture. Jack was on the railings, preening himself when the photographer came up to him and held his camera to take a picture. "Ark!" said Jack, and swooped in to take a closer look at the camera. It was just the sort of thing Jack likes for his load of rubbish collection. But the photographer was alarmed and flapped his arm at Jack to keep him away. "Good morning, dear," said Jack, and flew away over the school as if he had more important things to do. "Bother," said our teacher. "I was thinking of getting the regional television people to come and film him too." But Jack isn't the sort of bird to sit nicely for cameras. So I thought I had better write down his story and you can see what he's like from the drawings. I hope you like that one. Jackdaw from the story chest. Have a lovely day.